And that sets us up for Kantianism, that being the thing that I said at the end of the last lecture. I remain here in Vancouver, continuing to broadcast, recording these right in a row. So Kantianism is an alternate ethical theory, an alternative to utilitarianism. Kant was kind of an interesting fellow. He lived in Königsberg, which was Prussian at the time. Now it's Kaliningrad. It's a little Russian enclave surrounded by Germany, and I think, or maybe Poland or someplace. I can't remember. He lived a very sort of disciplined, boring, regimented life. People say that you could set your clocks based on when he took his walk, because he took his walk at exactly the same time every day. I think he never traveled very far from where he was born, maybe, or something. I don't know. But he was an extremely influential philosopher, did important work in almost every branch of philosophy, in metaphysics, epistemology, political philosophy. What we're going to be talking about is Kant's ethics. A lot of people have defended Kant. He's had a huge impact on all sorts of things. Most prominent contemporary defender is this person, Christine Korsgaard. She's a professor at Harvard, if you want an example of a contemporary Kantian. I will say going in, Kant is very difficult to understand. That's why I didn't assign you a reading for this. It's hard to get a reading by Kant or about Kant that's even comprehensible. So I'm going to give you my own interpretation. In fact, at points I won't even be giving you my own interpretation. I'll be giving you kind of a simplified version of my own interpretation. But, professional philosophers argue endlessly about how to interpret Kant. So, this will be the hardest of the ethical theories we discuss, I think. So things can only kind of get easier from here. I think the place to start is with this distinction Kant draws between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. So an imperative here is like a command, an authoritative rule, right? A hypothetical imperative only applies under certain conditions. So you think about like hypothetical questions, or like, well, what if such and such a thing was true, right? A hypothetical imperative is an imperative. It's like a rule that only kicks in given that something else is the case, right? And specifically what a hypothetical imperative is it's a rule that tells you if you want to achieve a certain end, how you achieve it, right? So if you want to be a good tennis player, then practice tennis. If you don't care about being a good tennis player, you don't have to practice tennis, right? This is a rule that you only need to follow if you have a certain end that you might not have. An end here is a goal, right? If your goal is to become better at tennis, you need to practice tennis. Otherwise, you don't need to. So it's a hypothetical imperative. It's not one that applies to everybody. Not everybody needs to go practice tennis, only the people who are trying to get better at it, right? Kant is very concerned by another philosopher named David Hume, and Hume thought that practical reason, I've used this term before, I guess I should have defined it. Practical reason is like, what is it reasonable to do, right? This consisted only of hypothetical imperatives. So in other words, every fact about what you should do is just relative to some goal you have. It's all relative to what you happen to desire. So if you want to help other people, it's reasonable to help them. If you want to abuse them, it's reasonable to abuse them, for Hume. because everything is just a matter of how you fulfill whatever goals you happen to have. But there's nothing further to be said about what goals you should have, or, and there's nothing that you need to do apart from what goals you have, etc. Hume at one point says there's nothing unreasonable about preferring that, 1 million people die on the other side of the world than that you get your finger scratched slightly. Any set of goals could be equally reasonable, and then all you would have reason to do is just whatever fulfills those goals. And Kant thinks that this position is a very serious threat to morality, right? Moral requirements are supposed to apply to everybody. It's not just, well, if you want to, you want to care about other people, care about them. You don't want to care about them, don't, If you want to steal stuff, steal stuff. You don't want to steal stuff, It's not, these aren't optional. Whether you behave morally isn't just supposed to depend on, whether you want to or not, right? Or whether you have reason to behave morally isn't just supposed to depend on whether you want to or not. These are supposed to be things that, apply to everybody. It's not like you can, it's reasonable to break the moral rules just because you don't care about them. This is what Kant thinks. So Kant is attempting to locate a categorical imperative. And this is going to be a rule of reason that applies to everybody everywhere, quite apart from any contingent features about them, right? This is the contrast with the hypothetical imperative. That only applies to some people, only applies given a certain condition is fulfilled, namely, only applies if you happen to have a certain goal. Categorical imperative applies to you regardless of what you want, right? Doesn't matter whether you want the categorical imperative to apply to you, it does. And the categorical imperative, he thinks, is the basis of morality. There has to be this rule of practical reason that applies to everybody. And Kant's strategy for showing the rational authority of the categorical imperative, actually, I should title this in line with the way I've been titling other slides. Whoops. Why be moral? This is Kant's answer to the why be moral question. The categorical imperative, we're going to talk about what the categorical imperative is in a minute, don't worry. But this categorical imperative, this moral rule that applies to everybody no matter what, you have already accepted it. And so has everybody else. So in a way, I said it applies to you whether you want it to or not. Well, maybe another way to put it would be, well, everybody has already agreed to it, right? Everybody already gives themselves this as a rule. And so the reason that it's that you should be moral, the reason that it's rational to obey the categorical imperative, is that you have kind of already committed yourself to obeying the categorical imperative. You already laid it down as a rule for yourself freely, autonomously. And that means, and you had to do that as a precondition for acting. In other words, in order to act intelligibly, you have to presuppose that the categorical imperative is true. So you've already presupposed it. And therefore, if you violate it, you are contradicting your own will. You've already willed the categorical imperative. You are contradicting yourself if you act against it, and that's irrational. On the other hand, the moral person is autonomous, and autonomous literally, auto is self, nomos is law. The moral person is autonomous. They are self-governing, they give themselves their own law and obey it, and they act in accordance with, they are a sort of a coherent individual, an individual with integrity, an individual that is not having conflicting aims, And so the answer to the why be moral question for Kant when you wonder, why should I follow the categorical imperative, his answer is, you already presupposed it in order to do anything. You've already agreed, you've already committed yourself to following this categorical imperative. Okay, so I've said the word categorical imperative about 500 times. What is the categorical imperative? What is this thing that, in order to act, you already presuppose that it was true? Well, he gives several formulations of it, and they're all supposed to be somehow or other equivalent. They're all supposed to be kind of different ways of stating the same point. And we're going to focus on the two most famous ones. These are the universability formula and the humanity formula. To many people, it doesn't seem that these are the same thing, but Kant thinks that they're the same thing. So the first formula says, act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. A maxim is like a rule that you're going to follow. Okay, a maxim is a principle that governs your actions. And the thought here is supposed to be, when you're going to do something, you figure out what maxim you're obeying. What is the rule you're following? What principle are you acting in accordance with? And then you ask, could you rationally will that everybody follow that maxim? Could you rationally will that everybody act in accordance with the same principle that you are acting in accordance with? Okay. So, for instance, you have some problem. The only way you can get out of it is to make a promise you can't keep. You need some money, and you can promise your friend that you'll pay them back, but you're not really going to be able to pay them back. So should you make this promise that you know that you can't keep in order to solve your own problem? Kant thinks no. And here's this kind of complicated quote. To inform myself about whether a lying promise is in conformity with duty, is it moral to make the lying promise? I ask myself, would I be content that my maxim to get myself out of difficulties by a false promise should hold as a universal law for myself as well as for others? So in other words, the way we determine, is it moral for you to make the lying promise, the promise you know you can't keep, you think about, okay, I imagine the rule, make a false promise if it solves your problem, right? Get myself out of difficulties by a false promise. Could I will that everybody follow that maxim? Everybody decides that if they have some problem that they can solve by making a promise that they know that they can't keep. Could I want everybody to do that? Can I will that state of affairs where everybody makes these false promises? And he thinks, if I think about this, I realize I can will the lie. I can imagine, like, just wanting myself to tell the lie, right, to get out of promises. But I can't will that lying be a universal law, that making false promises is a universal law. And the reason is, well, look, if everybody made false promises every time it would solve a problem for them, there would be no more promises, because everybody would know that everybody was lying all the time, right? It's kind of similar to this question about act utilitarianism and, you know, what if everybody just broke their promises anytime they thought it would do more good or something. If everybody just made promises every time they thought that it would help them in some way, even if they had no intention of following through, nobody would trust other people's promises anymore. And then even the action of making a promise to benefit yourself wouldn't work. Right? Because you would tell your friend you'd pay them back and they wouldn't believe you, because nobody keeps their promises in this world. So the thought here is, in order to test whether the action is universalizable, whether it follows this universalizability formula, what I have to do is I think about what is the principle governing my action, and then I think, could I will that everybody behave that way? In the false promising case, I couldn't, because if that was universalized, it would undermine itself. The action wouldn't work if everybody did this thing. And so one way that a maxim can fail to be universalizable is that it's impossible for everybody to follow it. I can't will that everybody make false promises because it's actually impossible for everybody to do that. My ability to make false promises depends on the fact that other people don't make false promises. So the possibility of making a lying promise, a false promise, depends on the fact that people usually keep their promises. You couldn't even make promises, or if you did, they wouldn't benefit you at all if everybody behaved this way, because nobody would believe other people's promises, right? Furthermore, there's another way for something to fail to be universalized, and that's, okay, I can coherently imagine that everybody follows this. It's not like the promise case where it's literally impossible for everybody to do this and fulfill what they want. But I will something else that is incompatible with the thing being universalized. And we'll see some examples of this in just a second. Okay, so the other way is I imagine, what if everybody followed this, and then I realize, no, there's something else I want, and that would be destroyed if everybody followed this maxim. And that's the other way that something can fail to be universalizable. And I said a minute ago, Kant thinks that you've already committed to the categorical imperative. You have to presuppose it every time you act. Well, how is it that I have presupposed this universalizability stuff every time I act? And I take it Kant thinks something like this. Look, if you perform an action, you have to think that you're doing it for a good reason, right? Your action can't even make any sense to you if you don't think you're doing it for a good reason. So it's a precondition of action that you think you're doing it for a good reason. But at the same time, you also are committed to thinking that if something is a good reason for you, it's a good reason for anybody else, right? It's not like there's something special about you that makes things good reasons for you and not for other people. And so, if you really believe that something is a good reason for you to do something, you have to be happy with the situation where it's a good reason for everybody else, and everybody else does the same thing. If you think, no, I wouldn't be happy with other people doing it, then you can't be happy with yourself doing it, because if you realize it's not a good reason for other people, then it's irrational to think it's a good reason for you. Why would you be any different? And so if you do the act anyway, what you're doing has to be a bad reason by your lights, because you agree it's not a good reason for other people. You agree that if it's not a good reason for other people, it's not a good reason for you. And so you're committed to thinking it's not a good reason for you if it's not universalizable. And that's the answer to the why be moral question here is, you're already committed to the categorical imperative insofar as you're already committed to thinking good reasons are good reasons for everybody. And so if you can't will that everybody act on this reason, then you're committed to thinking it's a bad reason. So when I ask why should I be moral, why shouldn't I do the evil deed, the answer is you already have agreed that this is a bad reason. You've already realized it's a bad reason, but when you recognize that you don't want other people to do evil deeds. And so the evil person contradicts themselves, and that's how they're irrational. There's a contradiction in their own will. This is quite a difficult point, I get, and a lot of people don't think that it works. Maybe if it doesn't make sense to you, maybe your understanding and you just think that it's wrong, right? But try to think about this and see if you can get the point that Kant is going for here. It is hard. It is hard. And he also thinks that this fits well with our ordinary intuitions. So it's not just that he has this principle-based argument, whatever. It's also supposed to mesh with common sense morality. People say stuff like, how would you like it if everybody else did that? Or what if somebody did that to you? And you might think of that as kind of a common sense version of the categorical imperative. You're thinking, yeah, well, what if people generally behaved this way? And you're thinking, if the answer is that would be bad, then maybe you have to agree that it's bad for you to behave that way, right? So maybe universalizability is kind of found in it's sort of the philosophically complicated way of spelling out this very ordinary thought, right? He gives 4 other examples, which are supposed to help us understand how to apply this universal law formula in practice. And these are going to involve suicide, lying, developing your talents, and providing charitable aid to other people. We'll go through these in turn. Someone feels sick of life because of a series of troubles, but it's not like he can't control his actions. He is still in control of his actions and responsible enough that he can wonder, would it be permissible for him to commit suicide? You might imagine maybe someone in an honor culture who has been, like a samurai who's been disgraced and is expected to commit suicide, ritual suicide or something. We're not imagining, someone who's mentally ill and maybe can't be held responsible for their actions. We're supposed to be imagining someone who's in a difficult situation and, but is still in control of themselves and is wondering whether it's permissible to commit suicide. And Kant thinks the way to answer this is you think, well, okay, this person is going to obey the maxim, from self-love I make it my principle to shorten my life when its longer duration threatens more troubles than it promises agreeableness. And then you wonder, could that be a universal law of nature? And Kant thinks it would be impossible for this to be a universal law because it would destroy life by means of the same feeling whose destination, whose purpose, is to impel towards the furtherance of life. To destroy life by means of the same feeling whose destination is to impel towards the furtherance of life would contradict itself and would therefore not subsist as nature. What he's thinking is, this is a situation where self-love, which is supposed to naturally cause people to continue to live and to create new life and this sort of stuff. Here you're imagining that it causes you to destroy yourself, to destroy life. And he thinks that would somehow not be a coherent situation. It wouldn't be coherent for one and the same feeling to have the natural purpose of causing life to continue, but then also cause life to end sometimes. And therefore he thinks it would be immoral for this person to commit suicide, for the samurai to commit suicide. You might wonder, one question is whether Kant is applying the categorical imperative correctly in these cases. I'm just telling you what he says, right? You can maybe pause and ask yourself whether it makes sense what he's saying, that there's a contradiction involved here. Such a system of nature somehow would destroy itself, right? That's his claim. Or we return to the lying example. Okay, he actually uses the same example that I used a minute ago. I forgot about that. you need to borrow money, you know you can't repay it, you know you're not going to get lent the money unless you promise to repay it. So you consider the maxim, when I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know that this will never happen. How would it be if that became a universal law? That couldn't hold as a universal law because, of course, if everybody did that, nobody would lend you money, right? This one, the derivation at least makes sense, right? You can see how the application is supposed to follow here. If everybody did this, then the institution of false promising would not make any sense because nobody would give you the money anyway. It would be self-defeating to universalize this, right? If it was universal, you wouldn't be able to get the money. Anyway. So you can't will that this be universalized because then you wouldn't even fulfill your goal. And so it turns out that lying to get the money is immoral for Kant. A third finds in himself a talent that by means of some cultivation can make him a human being useful for all sorts of purposes. But he is in comfortable circumstances and prefers to give himself up to pleasure rather than trouble himself with improving these talents. So, you have talents that would make you a very good doctor, and we need more doctors. You could really help people. But you inherited some money, and you preferred just playing video games, and you're wondering, is it okay to just sit around and play video games rather than learning how to become a doctor? And he thinks nature could indeed subsist with such a universal law. So it isn't impossible to imagine that nobody ever develops their talents, right? You can't imagine that. But he thinks, as a rational being, you necessarily will that all your capacities be developed, since they serve you and are given to you for all sorts of possible purposes. So this is supposed to be a case where universalizing it is coherent, but it conflicts with something else you want. He says, necessarily you will that all of your capacities be developed, and therefore you can't coherently will that you not develop your talents. You might wonder where that comes from. A rational being necessarily wills that his faculties be developed since they serve him and have been given to him for all sorts of possible purposes. Again, maybe Kant is not always correct about what his principles imply, but that's what he says. This is maybe a more plausible application for Kant. Another person for whom things are going well, you just inherited some money while others have to contend with great hardships. You've got, way more money than you need. Other people are in need, and you think, what is it to me? I'm not going to help these other people. I'm not going to contribute anything to charity. I'm not going to help other people using my stuff. And he thinks, again, this is a case where it's possible for everybody to behave that way. You could imagine nobody ever helping other people in need. But sometimes you need help from other people. Or at least you might wind up in situations where you need help from other people. Sometimes you need the love and sympathy of others. And if you imagine the world where nobody ever helps other people, that means nobody's ever going to help you. And therefore you can't rationally will this world where nobody helps other people. Because you need help from other people. And so since you want help from other people, you can't want it to be the case that nobody ever helps other people. So this is not universalizable. And here I said there are two formulations of the categorical imperative. Here's the second formulation. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of any other, always as an end in itself, never as a mere means only. So always treat humanity as an end, a goal in itself, never as a mere means. Some things are valuable only as means. So a shovel is valuable only because it lets you do something else, right? It lets you dig stuff up. The idea is people, though, are not valuable just for some other reason. They're valuable in themselves. They have intrinsic value. And you disrespect that if you treat them as mere means, and so that's bad. Now, in saying this, he's not saying that you can never use somebody as a means. You're using me as a means to gain knowledge about Kant. I might use the mechanic as a means to fix my car. What's supposed to be a problem is treating somebody as a mere means, treating them as if they were nothing more than a means, treating them as if they're not also an end in of themselves, right? Oops. This version of the categorical imperative, by the way, was quoted by Joe Biden on the campaign trail. I don't know if you all... here, let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, so here you can see a brief breakdown of Joe Biden's Immanuel Kant obsession. He quoted this humanity formula a couple times. People should never be treated as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves. And he's talking about workers particularly. Workers shouldn't be treated just as means to profit. They should be treated as ends in and of themselves, as people with their own intrinsic value. So I don't know if Joe Biden has actually read Immanuel Kant or not, but I guess I said, this material is difficult and kind of abstruse, but like I said, he has been influential. Sorry, I'm making some tea in the background, and the machine is making a noise. I'm not sure if that's audible or not. I'll pause until the tea is finished. There we go. I think Kant's thought, how is it that we're all committed to this humanity formula? I think Kant's thought is something like this. Well, when you pursue a goal, when you pursue an end, you have to think it's worth pursuing, right? But why is it worth pursuing? Well, because you value it. And that means you have to think that you can bestow value on things by valuing them. And in order for you to do that, it has to be that you have some kind of value in and of themselves. What you value matters because you are valuable. And that's why it matters what you care about. Korsgaard says, if the value of the things you pursue rests in the fact that they're important to you, then in pursuing them, you're in effect taking yourself to be important. You have to think that you are important in order to think it matters what you care about. But the Kantian thought is, if you do that, you have to recognize that other agents have the exact same value, right? What matters to them must matter too. And so they must have value in and of themselves. Again, because you're not relevantly different. And so it's going to be unreasonable for you to treat others as if they don't have value and they are merely, means that are important only to you insofar as they can serve your goals. And he revisits these four examples, and what he's going to do is he's going to try to show this version of the categorical imperative gives the same results as the other version. So he thinks the person contemplating suicide is going to make use of himself as a means to maintain a tolerable condition up to the end of life. But you are a thing, not something that can be used merely as a means. I therefore cannot dispose of a human being in my own person by killing him. You cannot treat any human being, including yourself, as a mere means to anything, including maintaining a tolerable condition up to the end. and he thinks that's what you're doing in that case. Again, you can ask whether he's correct about this or not, but that's what he thinks. In the false promise case, he thinks, well, you're trying to make use of another person as an end. You recognize that the other person cannot possibly consent to what you're doing, right? They wouldn't agree with you tricking them into lending them money. You're treating them as if they're a mere thing that you can manipulate for your own purposes. And that's condemned by the categorical imperative. In the case where you just play video games instead of developing your talents, maybe you're not using yourself as a mere means, he thinks, but you are failing to treat yourself as an end in yourself. Because he thinks there are in humanity predispositions to greater perfection. And, failing to develop your talents is failing to take seriously your value. It's failing to sort of show appropriate respect for yourself, something like that. Again, you might wonder where exactly that comes from. That's what he says. And he thinks the same thing about refusing to provide charitable aid. The natural end all human beings have is their own happiness. You want your own happiness, naturally. So do other people. But if nobody ever aids anyone else in need, you are not treating other people as ends in themselves, because you're not promoting their happiness, right? You're not treating their happiness as important because they value it and because they are important. You're indifferent to whether they are happy or suffer because you're not aiding them, and so you're not really using them as a means there. You're not using them. You're just letting them languish. But you're failing to respect them as ends in and of themselves, he thinks. You can tell from these quotes his writing style is not great. But if we think back to our friends, the trolley problems, Kant presumably is going to say that killing the hiker or pushing the large guy, those would also be using these people as mere means. So he's going to think that's wrong, right? You're using them as means to save the lives of others. But that's not okay. Not totally clear what he would say about the first case. But the other cases, it seems fair to say he is going to think use as mere means, not good. Now, I refer to these as lines of attack against Kantianism. Some of them maybe are just like questions for Kantians, or, things Kantians have to say something about, or whatever. Some of them maybe are objections, some of them maybe are just kind of puzzles, or things you might wonder about. First of all, at least as Kant interprets it, it looks like the categorical imperative has implications that a lot of people find really implausible. Kant, for instance, thinks that you can never lie in any circumstance because of reasoning similar to what we said earlier. Well, if everybody lied all the time, or everybody lied whenever it was expedient for them, then lying wouldn't even work because nobody would believe you. Oops. What is this? Sorry about that. And so you can never lie in any circumstance, no matter the situation, no matter the consequences. If there are Jews hiding in your attic, and the Nazis come to the door, you can't lie to them. He's not saying you have to tell them the truth. Don't tell them the truth. That would be bad. But you can't lie to them. You can maybe refuse to answer, or you can hope they get distracted, or maybe you can try to misdirect them. But you can't lie to them. Because if everybody lied about these things, they wouldn't believe you anyway. And Kant explicitly affirms this. There's a case that someone raises to him about there's a murderer at the door. The murderer asks, where is this person I'm trying to murder? And Kant says, no, you can't lie to him. Even if it's the only way to save the guy's life. Can't lie. A lot of people think that this is implausible. I mean, they think, yeah, it's bad to lie. Normally you shouldn't lie. But, like, if it's the only way to save somebody's life is to lie to a murderer, then, yeah, you should lie. A lot of people, a lot of modern Kantians actually try to get out of Kant's position on lying. They try to say, well, really, if you think about it in a different way, the categorical imperative doesn't necessarily forbid all lying. So a lot of modern Kantians will actually agree, okay, so, yeah, these are implausible implications, but Kant was kind of mistaken about the implications of his own theory. And that maybe sets up this next issue, which is that sometimes it's hard to see what the categorical imperative says about certain actions, or what it says about them. And sometimes Kant's explanations of how the categorical imperative delivers results seem kind of sketchy. It seems like maybe he's just working backwards, right? In the talents example, for instance, developing your talents, he says you can't will that people not develop their talents because as a rational being you necessarily will that your faculties be developed since they serve you and have been given to you for all sorts of possible purposes. But, like, what's the defense of that, you know? I mean, it kind of, you might worry here, well, really just Kant thought, yeah, you should develop your talents. And then he came up with some explanation for how the categorical imperative says that, but maybe the explanation doesn't really work, or it's not really a good one, right? You know, the suicide example. How did he get this idea that nature would destroy itself if people in certain circumstances, you know? So, to illustrate this, ask yourself, what will Kant think about the death penalty? What will Kant think about executing murderers? Pause and come up with an answer to that. Will Kant think executing murderers is good, or will Kant think executing murderers is bad? What does he think the categorical imperative is going to say about that? Usually when I ask people this in person, they think Kant will be against the death penalty. He'll think, you know, executing the guy doesn't treat him as an end in himself. Executing people not universalizable, can't execute everybody, you know. It turns out that Kant is extremely pro-death penalty. And his justification is, well, this guy committed a murder, therefore he endorsed the maxim, kill everybody. So actually you respect him and treat him as an end by killing him. You're treating him in accordance with the way that he thinks that people should be treated. But I don't think anybody could have guessed in advance that that was what the categorical imperative would imply, right? Kant, it seems like probably thought that the death penalty was good for murderers and then worked backwards, right? Now, it might be, if that's what Kant is doing, sometimes he just kind of, you know, he jury-rigs things so that it gives the result he wants. Maybe that's just a problem with Kant himself. Maybe he was right about the categorical imperative, but, you know, he was wrong about how to imply it, and other people can fix this. But you might worry that it's a problem with the categorical imperative itself. Maybe it's sort of too abstract, too, you know, whatever, in order to, like, actually give judgments about lots of cases. Maybe it can't tell us for a lot of the moral questions we have, maybe it doesn't actually have anything to say. And if so, you might think that that's a problem. If it doesn't actually give you an answer to the question whether you have to develop your talents or not. Here's another worry you might have about the universalizability formula. So what I'm supposed to do is think about the maxims in question, right, and whether they can be universalizable. But that's going to depend upon what maxim we think I'm following. And the thing is that by changing how specific or how general you make the maxim, you can change the moral status of the action. So I guess I said Notre Dame here. This was maybe I must have made the initial version of this slide back when I was still teaching at Notre Dame. Here we go, UWT. So you might think, come to philosophy class at the University of Washington, Tacoma on Tuesday. That's not universalizable because not everybody in the world can fit in the building. If everybody tried to come to class, there'd be like a big crush of people, right? It'd be a big catastrophe. But coming to class is permissible, at least when it's not an online class and there's not too much COVID going around, that kind of stuff. This was also that's another indication that this slide was written a while back, right? This was when all the classes were in person. And so Kant will need to say, okay, in that case, your action is consistent if you come to class, the philosophy class on Tuesday at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Your action is consistent with following that and with a bunch of other maxims that would predict the same action, right? So he has to say, really, the maxim is something more general. Get a philosophy education. That's universalizable. But then there are other cases where if we make the maxim too general, things can become universalizable it shouldn't be. I lie to you. You say, hey, if I lend you this money, are you going to pay me back? And I say, yes. And I say, I was following the maxim, answer questions when people ask them. I guess that would be universalizable. Yeah, people can answer questions when people ask them. But that's too general, right? There it needs to be something more specific. What matters is that I'm answering the questions dishonestly. And so, because by making the maxim more specific or more general, we can change whether it's okay, there has to be some right way of characterizing what maxim I'm following, some privileged way of describing the thing. It can't just be the right way to describe it is whichever one gets the result Kant wants, right? There's got to be something more to it than that, I guess. And so then we need to ask, well, okay, what determines what this special way of characterizing? What determines what is the right way to describe what I'm doing? And it's unclear whether there's a good answer to that. You might think one thing would be to say, well, the maxim needs to include all and only the morally important features of the situation, right? What's morally important about coming to philosophy class is that you're getting a philosophy education. It's not whether it's at UWT or whether it's on Tuesday. What's morally important about me lying to you is that I'm lying to you, right? It's not just that I'm answering a question. I'm leaving out something morally relevant. But then if we have to determine what more, because we haven't applied the categorical imperative here yet, right? We're formulating the maxims at this point, and then we're going to use that and the categorical imperative to determine what the morality of the thing is. It looks like what are the morally important features of the situation have to be given by something other than the categorical imperative. And if that's true, Kantianism is false. The categorical imperative itself isn't going to tell you whether the fact that it's at UWT on Tuesday is significant or not. That's something you decide, and then you apply the categorical imperative to it, right? So it looks like the Kantian can't say the privileged way of describing it involves appealing to the morally relevant features, because then there would have to be something else going on and Kantianism couldn't be like the fundamental thing. I'm not sure if that made sense or not. You can write me an email if that didn't make sense. There are also cases where you might worry that universalizability will kind of give weird results because of who the person doing the universalizing is. Suppose Superman considers the maxim, whoever can take something gets it. If you want something, just take it. If the other person doesn't want you to take it, fight them. Whoever wins gets it. You might think, well, Superman could rationally win that because he'll always win the fight. But then it wouldn't be like, oh, okay, so you're allowed to take stuff as long as you can get away with it, right? So maybe what Kant should say is something like, well, maybe what matters is whether everybody could rationally will the maxim, not just you. Or maybe he'll say, well, when we're determining whether you can rationally will the maxim, you can't take into account any specific features of yourself. You can't take into account the fact that you're Superman or not. Something like that. I don't know. That's one that I say is just kind of maybe it's just a question that the Kantians need to answer. What's the best way to do this? Here's a worry specific to the humanity formula. You might think lots of wrongdoing doesn't have anything to do with using people as means, and sometimes maybe even use as mere means is okay. You drive recklessly and you hit a pedestrian. Okay, well, you acted wrongly. You didn't use them as a means to anything. Okay, well, maybe you failed to treat them as an end by driving recklessly. Well, okay, but is the means end thing really illuminating anything here? I mean, the means thing is not doing anything. Really, I guess maybe what we're saying is just treat other people as ends in and of themselves. I guess that's a useful thing to know, but, is that what determines whether you're treating somebody as an end? It's not just whether you're avoiding treating them as a mere means, because you don't treat them as a means at all here. And you might worry, we have to kind of flesh out what it is to treat somebody as an end so much that maybe we're importing some other understanding of, tacitly to determine whether I'm treating you as an end. What we're thinking of is like, am I treating you in a way that's morally permissible or not, right? Maybe you think, well, clearly I wrong you by running you over recklessly, and so I'm not treating you as an end. But then we have some sense of what's moral independent of the categorical imperative, don't we? It's supposed to be that my failing to treat you as an end is what makes it wrong, and so what counts as that has to be independent of the moral judgment, or else it's circular. Again, maybe this is too difficult. I don't know. Suppose some gangster goes to buy coffee. This is an example from Derek Parfit. He just views everybody else as a means. He would happily just kill the barista and still steal the coffee, but it's too much trouble. He buys some coffee. The barista makes him the coffee. It seems like he views the barista as a mere means to him getting coffee, doesn't he? But is it wrong for him to buy the coffee? I mean, you might imagine I'm listing off all of the evil deeds that this gangster does, and I tell you about how he views people, all these mere means, all that stuff, and you're like, oh, that's awful. And I say, and also he bought coffee. You probably wouldn't be like, oh man, further evidence of his evil, you might think, well, maybe we should say Kant should say the guy doesn't treat them as mere means. He doesn't place any weight on their interests. He acts in accordance with not placing any weight in their interests. But he doesn't treat them as mere means all the same, even though he uses them as means. Okay, so why is it that he's not treating them as mere means, even though he views them as mere means and is using them as means? Again, you might be tempted to say, well, there's nothing wrong with buying the coffee, but then, it can't be that treating somebody as a mere means is treating it. You treat them as a mere means in virtue of treating them wrongly. Because whether you treat them as a mere means is supposed to determine whether you treat them wrongly, right? So, generally speaking, I'm not sure. Maybe this point's too hard. But the basic thought is you might worry, in order to figure out whether we're treating people as ends and whether we're treating them as mere means, we need to have some independent grasp of whether we're treating them in a way that's right or wrong. And if that's right, then that other thing is the real fundamental moral principle. It's not the stuff about ends and means. And that's probably a good place to stop. I know this was a difficult lecture. I think this will be the hardest of the kind of substantive moral lectures. Yeah. Lectures next week will probably be a little bit shorter.